Welcome to the new Hegelian philosophy channel. Today I'd like to share a reader's guide or walkthrough of Immanuel Kant's classic book, The Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. I'll share this both in video form here over YouTube and in textual form on my substack. The link to that will be provided in the video description. Now, the Prolegomena is a work which I think has a very strange status within the history of Western philosophy because it is admittedly a very obscure text, which is far less widely read than it deserves to be. In all of my life, in all of the bookstores I've ever been to, I've never actually seen a physical copy of this book for sale anywhere except the university bookstore when I was an undergrad. There was one college course I took in which it was assigned basically because there was not enough time to assign the whole Critique of Pure Reason, so this was read as a shorter and more concise alternative, a more accessible alternative, basically. But otherwise, I've never actually seen it for sale anywhere. So it's a book which is not widely read, despite the fact that Immanuel Kant is somebody that virtually everyone interested in philosophy will try to read at some point in time. One of the most read philosophers, I think, is somebody who also most people just pass over this work, maybe on the assumption that, it's just like a shorter version. It's like a synopsis of the Critique of Pure Reason, so if you can just read the full version in the critique, then you don't need this book. I think that myth, however, should be countered with the truth, which is a good deal more complicated. In reality, the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics isn't just a shorter version of the critique or like a SparkNotes summary of it. Instead, the Prolegomena is a masterpiece of philosophy which should be read by everyone, even those quite familiar with the other three critiques. It should be read by everyone for its own merits. This is a book which has the benefit of maintaining a laser focus on one question in particular, which is whether metaphysics is possible as a science. Now, the method Kant uses to show that it is not, his belief is that metaphysics cannot be done as a science, involves both the negative dismissal of metaphysics as failing to live up to the criteria of real sciences that have knowledge you can validate as true, you can trust as true. That part of it is the negative dismissal of metaphysics for failing to live up to those criteria, but another big part of the book is the positive explication of what exactly makes those other sciences valid, and that's an extremely fascinating meditation on, say, mathematics and pure physics, etc., which I think everybody would do well to read. So as we get into the text itself, we find that although Kant does not believe that metaphysics can be done as a science, he basically opens the text by playing devil's advocate for a moment and saying, okay, if we do accept that metaphysics can be done as a science, we have to first clarify what sets metaphysics apart from the other sciences, what makes it different from, say, mathematics or pure physics in the sense of the theories of Isaac Newton, etc. And his answer to that is that metaphysics differs from the other sciences because the things that it studies, ultimately three of them are the most important, include the following. Metaphysics will try to study God, the soul, and the cosmos. Now, those might seem familiar already from, say, the religious tradition. Within Christianity and related religions, you also study God, the soul, and the cosmos. But metaphysics is going to do this very differently. Whereas in the religions of, say, the Abrahamic tradition, you also talk about God, the soul, and the cosmos. You don't really do it in a metaphysical manner because you don't rely on purely rational methods to arrive at your knowledge about those things. Instead, within the Abrahamic religions, you are able to fall back on a divinely inspired text. So you have the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, etc., as these texts which are understood to have been authored by God himself, and God is speaking about himself from his own perspective. And within the context of religion, that's perfectly legitimate, but metaphysics is going to do something totally different. Metaphysics is going to arrive at the truths about God, the soul, and the cosmos through nothing except the power of thinking itself. This is what he means by purely rational grounds, and therefore it is going to be a purely a priori science, a science before experience, is the more literal translation from Latin, but contemporary Kant scholars prefer the term independent of rather than before. So metaphysics is an a priori science because all of this knowledge will have to be independent of experience rather than dependent on experience. The term favored by Kant scholars for a posteriori, which more literally means after experience. So there are some sciences that are dependent on experience and observation. For example, zoology is an a posteriori science because you can only know the life cycle and habits and characteristics and size, etc., of a species of elephants or rhinoceroses, etc., if you have a zoologist empirically observe these things and then collect the data, etc. In contrast, there are a priori sciences, like, say, mathematics, in which you do not actually know anything about numbers, geometrical figures, etc., through observing anything with, say, the five senses. Instead, those are purely abstract constructs of your own thinking, which are independent of experience in the sense that even if you see, say, a collection of 2 apples and 3 oranges, the number 2 and the number 3 are never really experienced. Those might be aids to your understanding of them, but the numbers themselves are not physical things. You somehow know them independently of any experience. Similarly, a circle is something which you may see a circular object that looks kind of like one, but a real circle can only be known purely abstractly. A real circle is that for which every point is equidistant from the center, and that which has no depth. So if you draw a circle on a piece of paper, it's not really a circle because not every point will be equidistant from the center, and even if it's almost imperceptible, once you draw it, the lead from your pencil gives it depth. Now it's at best a cylinder, but not a circle. So if metaphysics is possible, it has to be like mathematics rather than like zoology, because although it is possible to make inquiries into the self of an empirical or a posteriori knowledge, such as in psychology, that is not what metaphysics is interested in. Psychology can study the self as a living organism with a brain that is hardwired a certain way, and which can be conditioned by environmental influences in a behaviorist manner, kind of like Pavlov's dog that is trained to salivate at the sound of a bell even if there's no food. Psychology studies the self also, but in a merely a posteriori empirical manner. In contrast, metaphysics will try to study the self as a soul that is an object of knowledge that is totally independent of experience or observation, but at the same time can be known through the mind's own thinking without having to rely on something, say, divinely inspired from the traditional religions. Now, Kant asks the very legitimate question whether we can actually put metaphysics in the same group as, say, mathematics or logic or the pure physics that you get through at least some of the theory of Isaac Newton. He asks whether that's possible if we consider what exactly it is that makes those a priori sciences valid, and then ask whether metaphysics has anything in common with them. Well, in order to do that, we have to supplement the terminology of a priori and a posteriori with some other terms. These are analytic and synthetic, and these concern ultimately the kinds of judgments that are being made within the science. So within traditional logic, a judgment is something that, for example, relates one concept to another. Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. So this relation of a subject to a predicate is something which in traditional logic can be understood to be of either an analytic or a synthetic nature. So some judgments are analytic because the subject and the predicate are basically, at best, paraphrases of the same meaning. So an example of an analytic judgment is all bodies are extended. Well, if something is extended, if something is a body, well then I already know that it's extended because a body is an extended thing. So that is an analytic judgment because the predicate does not add anything new beyond what could already be known from the meaning of the subject. Another example of this is all bachelors are unmarried men. Well, a bachelor is an unmarried man, so those are just paraphrasing the same idea. Nothing new is added. You could also say that I am sitting to the left of the person who is sitting to the right of me. Now, it bears mentioning that an analytic judgment will remain inherently analytic even if you do, for example, go out to use observation to confirm that it is true. For example, empirical observation may confirm that, yes, indeed, gold is a yellow metal, but you didn't actually need experience to show that. If you knew the meaning of the concept gold, you would know, well, yes, gold is defined as a yellow metal. So judgment can be proven to be inherently analytic or inherently synthetic based on the content of its own concept. So an analytic judgment is one in which you are not adding anything new beyond the meaning of the terms, but perhaps at best you are explicating, you are making clear, you are elucidating what the meaning of these words might be. And for that reason, an analytic judgment is not useless, even if it is redundant. On the other hand, a synthetic judgment is one in which the concept in the predicate position actually does add something new beyond what could be known from the meaning of the concept in the subject position. Whereas I can know that a body is an extended thing, just from understanding the meaning of the concept. I cannot know that a body has a weight simply through understanding the meaning of the concept of a body. For that, I have to go beyond the concept and probably rely on experience, say the sort of scientific methods of like Isaac Newton to see, yes, indeed, a body also has a weight. So this is the difference between an analytic judgment and a synthetic one. Now, in the case of synthetic a posteriori judgments, those judgments which also rely on experience and observation to be proven true, this is something which basically just fits with common sense. It makes sense that you would know certain things about, say, zoology, the observation of animals, that are not included in the subject position because you supplemented that knowledge of the meaning of the concept in the subject position by actually gathering new data through the five senses. That's not so mysterious in itself. A statement like, Cheyenne is in Wyoming is a posteriori and synthetic because I cannot know from the meaning of the word Cheyenne itself that it's in Wyoming, but I can know that through observing. That's not so mysterious. What is really mysterious is the idea of a judgment that is both a priori and also synthetic. That's the real mystery. How can we know something independent of all experience that is not merely redundant or paraphrasing the meaning of the thing within the subject position? How can I have a predicate that does not simply state again what had already been contained in the subject position, but actually adds some new information beyond it? Well, this is something we do have access to within the field of, say, mathematics. Within arithmetic, if I have an equation like 5 plus 7 equals 12, no matter how long I might think about the number 12, try to understand the meaning of it as a concept, I will never, from that understanding of the meaning of 12 alone, be able to arrive at the other side of that equation. No matter how long I try to think about the meaning of 12, in other words, I can never arrive at the numbers 5 and 7 through an analytic elucidation or explication of the number 12 alone. Instead, there's really new information presented there. And this is even clearer if we try to deal with extremely large numbers. If you have a number like 87,542, well, you can never arrive at the numbers 54,996 and 32,546 simply through understanding what the first number I mentioned means. Instead, there's real information which has to be new information which has to be presented on the other side of that equation. And this is something which Kant will explain is possible because within mathematics you are dealing with intuitions, which are kind of like experiences, although I don't want to use that word. They're presentations, okay? but of a purely a priori nature. So this will make maybe more sense if we move over to the geometrical side. Within geometry, I also cannot know simply through the understanding of the meaning of concepts that a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. In this case, those are not just different words, they're also different categories in the Aristotelian sense of the term. Whereas a straight line concerns the category of quality. The quality is that it's straight. Shortest distance concerns the category of quantity, because the shortest tells me quantitatively about its size. So these two clearly cannot just be paraphrases of the same idea. It's not just a redundant tautology that states the same thing twice in superficially different forms. Instead, Kant's answer to the riddle of how such synthetic yet a priori knowledge is possible within mathematics is that it's only possible for us because we rely on the aid of intuition to present that new information. So for Immanuel Kant, intuition is, of course, something we're always getting from our experiences of the world from the five senses. But beyond those empirical or a posteriori intuitions, there's also the possibility of a pure intuition in which you are not presenting, say, the objects within space. You're just presenting space itself. And if you do geometry, whether you realize it or not, that's what you're actually doing. You're not thinking of the spatial grid as populated by, say, a cup of coffee in front of me and a book on the desk and things like that. You're kind of subtracting out those objects to get a purified intuition of the spatial grid itself, and that is how you can know that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. On the other side, you can know about arithmetic through having a purified intuition of not space, as would be the case for geometry, but rather time. For indeed, it is only the purified intuition of time that allows me to move temporally from 12 to, later on the other side of that equation, 5 plus 7. Okay, so because mathematics can justify the validity of its truths through this appeal to the aid of intuition, we can accept that it has this paradoxical status as both synthetic and a priori. What about metaphysics, though? Do we know things of a synthetic a priori nature about God, the soul, and the cosmos through the aid of intuition? Well, not really. That's not exactly how we arrive at those truths. So there must be something else. There must be something, if metaphysics is a real science, that it also relies on, that allows it to be like mathematics, despite having nothing in common with it with regard to those things that make mathematics a valid science. On the other hand, later on within the text, Kant will deal in greater detail with pure physics as another example of a science that gives us synthetic a priori knowledge of, say, not just physical objects as they empirically exist, but rather the laws of nature, which are universal and necessary. But this is also not going to be of any help to metaphysics because, as we shall see later on, whereas mathematics relies on the help of purified intuitions of space and time, pure physics will allow one to speak of laws of nature by relying on something else, which is a different faculty of the subject, which is the understanding, where you find concepts, and specifically the purified concepts, which are called the categories. This is not really going to be of any help to us within metaphysics, though, because whereas physics can appeal to, say, the pure category of substance to explain why we interpret things as objects that endure over time with self-identity, rather than a chaotic flux of different contents that are never unified together. But that's not going to be of any help within metaphysics because we're not interested, in this case, for explaining the universal laws for how we experience things. We're interested in things which are never experienced, God, the soul, and the cosmos. Similarly, in pure physics, you have a priori synthetic status through the use of a category like cause and effect. This is why we can understand nature to be bound by laws, because that's just a fancy way of saying that all effects are understood to have causes. But that's something which is not derived from experience in and of itself. It's rather a use of a category which we all already have, the category of cause and effect. But that's not really going to be of any help within metaphysics because In metaphysics, we're not interested in talking about how the God, the soul, and the cosmos are observed as rule-bound, law-bound within experience as effects with causes, because we're talking about things outside of that realm altogether. God and the soul and the cosmos interest us precisely because they are not objects of possible experience. Now, on the other hand, we also can't really say that metaphysics deals with the kind of a priori knowledge which is merely analytic in nature, because merely analytic a priori judgments are true solely through their not violating the law of contradiction. So the law of contradiction for Aristotle basically stated that A is B and A is not B cannot both be true. Either A is B or A is not B. Only one of those can be true. And the analytic judgments, like say all bodies are extended, all bachelors are unmarried men, are true, but only because they don't violate this law of contradiction. Well, that's not really going to be of help in the field of metaphysics, because the things we're really interested in with regard to God, the soul, and the cosmos cannot be known simply through their not violating the law of contradiction. The things we're really interested in are things like, did the cosmos have a definite beginning in time or not? Is the soul free to act outside the chain of causes and effects, or is it unfree because it's caught up in that chain of causes and effects? Is God the first cause of all things or not? These are the sort of questions within metaphysics which, if they can be known with a definite yes or no answer, would not be the result of just these two terms not violating the law of contradiction. It would have to be something else. And yet, the valid means of synthetic a priori knowledge unearthed thus far for mathematics and physics are not applicable to metaphysics. So if it is valid as a science, it must get its validity from somewhere else. Now, as we get deeper within the text, we find that Immanuel Kant is basically going to structure the rest of the book around specific questions. The 4 questions are, how is pure mathematics possible? How is pure physics possible? How is metaphysics in general possible? And finally, how is metaphysics as a science possible? The first one of these, how is pure mathematics possible, is something which Kant also uses the section that is as an opportunity to prove basically the very controversial thesis that you actually do not experience the thing in itself as it is called. It's precisely the validity of mathematics dealing with purified intuitions of space and time, which indirectly gives us proof that what we experience is not actually the world or the thing in itself as it really is. Now, it was mentioned earlier in this video that mathematics can only be true because it relies on the help of intuitions of, say, space in and of itself, with all of the spatial objects subtracted out, or of time in and of itself, with all the empirical content subtracted out in order to be true. In fact, he says, quote unquote, without this, mathematics cannot take a single step. Now, this is something which indirectly proves that we do not experience the thing in itself for the following reason. If you are able to have purified intuitions of space and purified intuitions of time, this means that space and time, controversial as it might be to acknowledge, actually do not really exist. Or we could put this more specifically, space and time are not properties or attributes of the thing in itself. For if they were, then we could not have purified intuitions of them, of a merely subjective nature, which, by the way, is what makes them universally true. For although all of us do not experience the thing in itself in the same way, because we don't experience it at all, we do still have a universal agreement about the truths of mathematics, because our own subjective processing is the same, and it's the same on an a priori level. So we're in agreement that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Not because the thing in itself has actually shown that, because we can't see it. Rather, we agree on that because it is our own purified intuition of space, which is the same. Similarly, we agree that 5 plus 7 equals 12 because it is our purified intuition of time as different subjects that is exactly the same, proving that space and time do not exist as properties of the thing in itself, but are instead the purified forms of our own subjective processing. Or to put it more specifically for Kant, space is just the purified form of outer sense. You are able to sense things on the outside, like physical objects, through space, so space is just the purified form of outer sense. On the other hand, time is just the purified form of inner sense. There are things that you process or experience on the inside to, like, say, changes to your emotional state or changes to your states of feelings, etc. Those are on the inside, and they are situated within time, just as physical objects on the outside are situated within space. Now, this thesis that space and time don't really exist outside your mind, as you might put it in Philosophy 101 course, is something which is, of course, going to be extremely difficult for many people to swallow, but Kant provides the following fascinating thought experiment to show its validity. This is a thought experiment which is also mentioned by Deleuze near the beginning of the book, Difference in Repetition. He notes that if you have a right-handed glove and a left-handed glove, you know that they are different gloves without, however, being able to trace that knowledge of their difference back to anything conceptual. So if you were to list out all of the conceptual predicates of a left-handed glove, you would find that they would be the exact same list as you would have for the conceptual predicates of a right-handed glove. The left-handed glove and the right-handed glove, conceptually exactly the same, and yet we know that they're different, only because that knowledge of their difference is registered within intuition rather than understanding. It is registered in the presentation of the spatial grid that shows them in different spatial positions, incompatible spatial positions, such as you cannot put the right-handed glove on the left hand and vice versa. We are aware of this difference only because we can present the difference within intuition rather than understand the difference through concepts. If you were to imagine some hypothetical being like a strange group of aliens who could understand the meaning of concepts perfectly well but could not present spatial truths within intuition, they would never be able to understand this. Or like a mythical creature or something like that understands words but cannot present space, they would never be able to understand this. And this actually indirectly proves that space and time don't exist, because this is an example of something that is ultimately known through a purified intuition of space as the form of our outer sense. Now, in the second section of the text proper, Kant moves on to the question of how pure physics is possible as a knowledge of synthetic a priori judgments, much like mathematics. In this sense, Kant basically understands physics to be the theories of Isaac Newton, but because we do not directly experience the thing in itself, this is paradoxically going to be an a priori science, because what really interests us about pure physics is not just empirical observations of really existing physical things. No, what really interests us in pure physics is the way that it concerns laws of nature, which actually should have a universal and necessary character. And they're only going to be both universal and necessary if they are synthetic a priori, because they also concern the things that exist within nature, which are physical objects. Now, this is going to sound rather paradoxical, and especially is going to sound very difficult to prove if we do not have the ability to fall back on purified intuitions of space and time, as would be the case in mathematics. But there still will be a way to do this. So the universal laws of nature are not going to be everything within the theory of Isaac Newton. For example, Isaac Newton's talk of inertia is not going to concern us here, because it's not really pure. You need experience to know what inertia is, or to know that objects of a physical variety have it. But the statement about the laws of nature in a more general sense, like, for example, every event is determined by a cause according to constant laws, that's going to be synthetic a priori. Similarly, talking about the permanence of substances within Newtonian physics, that's also going to be synthetic a priori, because these are things which are universal and necessary as laws of nature, because they can be proven true independent of any appeal to empirical experience or observation. In fact, insofar as we do experience things as concrete physical objects, we already know in advance that those are going to behave in accord with universal laws of nature, because the laws of nature are given a priori, even if the physical objects that behave in accord with them are given a posteriori. Now, as was mentioned earlier, whereas mathematics can rely on purified intuitions of space and time to arrive at synthetic a priori judgments, pure physics will instead rely on a different faculty of the subject. So in addition to intuitions, the subject also has another faculty which deals with concepts. This is the understanding. Now, some of these concepts, of course, are going to be of a merely a posteriori or empirical nature. You could imagine a world in which there were no dogs. Nobody would have the empirical concept of a dog, because that concept of a dog was derived through experiencing these furry, four-legged things with, a cold, wet nose or whatever, called a dog. So in a hypothetical world where there were no dogs, nobody would have that concept. However, even in a hypothetical world with no dogs, you would still have certain other concepts, because these are a priori concepts, pure concepts that never were derived from empirical observation, because paradoxically, you were only able to have empirical observation because you already had these pure concepts. These are the categories which for Immanuel Kant are 12 in number, in accord with the table of judgments, which has 12 different positions, in accord with the traditional logic basically founded by Aristotle and then completed by Kant. Now, out of the 12 categories, Kant gives disproportionate emphasis to two of them in particular, especially within this book. Those are the two categories of substance and cause and effect, because these are the concepts you had to have already known. You had to have already had them in order for even the most basic experiences of the world to have made sense. For example, you only perceive objects as physically, or let's just say as enduring over time as the same one, and therefore identical with themselves, because you already had the concept of a substance. You already knew what a substance was, as that which endures over time, is self-identical with itself, etc., before you knew that this particular thing that you observed was an instance of that, a substance. Similarly, you observe the world as acting in accord with laws of nature, being bound by rules rather than a chaotic flux of disconnected happenings, because you already had the concept of cause and effect, basically derived from or in accord with the judgment of an if-then hypothetical form. So just as substance is correlated with the categorical judgment A is B, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal. The the category of cause and effect is correlated with the if-then statement. If Socrates is a man, then he is mortal. And this is something we're always making use of, even when we experience even very mundane things, because we can see the universe as acting in accord with laws, because we're really perceiving events to be effects with causes. That seems like common sense, but it's actually something we would not experience if we did not have the pure category. In a hypothetical world where some being did not have the categories of cause and effect and substance, they would not experience the world as consisting of self-identical, enduring objects behaving in accord with laws of nature, or a world where all effects have causes. That's something that we bring to experience by using the categories we already have, albeit in a manner that is basically automatic, unconscious, and something we have to have extreme amounts of effort to actually become aware that we are doing it. Now, in this section of the text, Kant also famously distinguishes so-called judgments of perception from judgments of experience as follows. To consider his own example, if I report that this little bit of sugar in my mouth is tasting sweet to me, or if I report that this wormwood is tasting bitter to me, I'm not really making a scientific statement, although I am describing something that was observed in a certain sense. The difference is that if I merely report on the association of sensations in an ad hoc manner. I'm not really doing science because there's no universal or necessary character to that. Instead, I would have to form a judgment of experience, in contrast with the judgment of perception I just talked about, in the following way. A judgment of experience is like a scientific observation because it has a universal validity, because it doesn't just report on one person's subjective state at a particular point in time. Instead, it has a universal validity by dealing much more explicitly with the use of the categories. Or to put this in very, very basic terms, a statement like, well, this sugar is tasting sweet to me, isn't really scientific in nature because there is no appeal to the category of cause and effect. I'm not stating that to be the effect of a specific cause, and therefore there is no appeal to a universal law of nature, something which would have apodictic necessity across all instances of that type. Instead, I'm just talking in an ad hoc manner about what is happening for this one instance with no ability to expand beyond that to include all instances of a given type. Now, at this point in the text, Kant very interestingly argues that the very reason why we inevitably and repeatedly fall for the temptation to engage in metaphysics, despite the fact that thousands of years of doing so have never really yielded any certain statements, is precisely that the pure categories universality and necessity seem, by their very nature, to exceed what can be offered up through the empirical contents that they would normally be applied to. So we are supposed to only use the categories like cause and effect, substance, etc. to make sense of merely empirical objects. But we have a sense that the latter are not really symmetrical with the universality and necessity of the categories themselves. We feel that there must be some sort of other domain of objects which we could supplement the mundane empirical realm with. We feel that there must be some other kind of a pure object which is universal and necessary in and of itself, which could live up to or equal the universality and necessity of the categories themselves. So we imagine that these extra objects that are universal and necessary, like the categories, are, say, the soul, the cosmos, and God himself. And in metaphysics, we find this hope generated for perhaps understandable reasons, but always leading into the same problem of generating an elaborate illusion, the transcendental illusion, as Kant calls it, in which something seems to appear where there's actually nothing at all. An illusion generated by the mind itself precisely through using the things which make its experience possible in the first place. Now, in the third section of the text proper, which is titled, How is Metaphysics in General Possible?, we find that Kant once again plays devil's advocate by accepting that, okay, if we are going to treat metaphysics as a pure science, we would have to clarify at this point exactly how it would be different from physics. And one thing we can say is that whereas physics deals with the concepts of the understanding, and specifically the pure concepts, like, say, the categories of substance and cause and effect, in order to explain the behavior of the objects of possible experience as being intelligible and bound by laws, etc., metaphysics does not do that at all. Instead, metaphysics deals with a rather different faculty, whereas mathematics deals with intuitions and pure physics deals with the understanding. Metaphysics, it turns out, actually deals with reason. Now, reason for Kant is the faculty that specifically goes beyond the understanding by going beyond the black and white false binary nature of the concepts. So reason goes beyond the black and white nature of the concepts of the understanding by instead generating what are called rational ideas. This is something which Kant at this point deals as pure rational ideas which can never be given in any possible experience. A great example of a rational idea is freedom itself. Now, the funny thing about freedom is we all have a sense of what it is, which is the possibility to act outside the deterministic chain of causes and effects. And in fact, we have to make some sort of an appeal to the idea of freedom in order to explain how ethical action is possible. You can only act ethically if you are doing it freely. If it's following as a determined effect of some cause, it's not really ethical. Okay, so we understand what freedom is as an idea, despite the fact that there is no object which actually serves as an instance of freedom. There's no possibility of looking at a physical thing and saying, oh yes, of course, that is an instance of freedom, in the sense that you would subsume the intuition of that thing under the concept of freedom in order to understand it to be, in the same way that you would subsume an intuition of, say, a dog under the concept of a dog to understand what it is. This is something which, once again, you do for the understanding, but you cannot do for the rational ideas, because at the end of the day, they are not concepts. They're not universal concepts for which you could find instances of things. Rather, the rational ideas are generated by reason itself in its attempt to, say, satisfy the need for a projection of totality, even if it is not empirically observed. For this reason, the cosmos itself is basically generated as a rational idea. You never observe that the cosmos has a totality, but you project the totality of a cosmos in a rational idea, because this is in accord with the nature of reason itself, trying to satisfy its own desire for completeness, etc. The problem is that the entire science of metaphysics at the end of the day deals with just such rational ideas. By its own nature, reason, Kant tells us, will inevitably get lost in metaphysics, because it's its nature to go beyond what the understanding and intuition can afford to it, can directly give to it, and project these ideas even if they have no empirical equivalence. The problem is that excessive use of this will lead to a transcendental illusion in which we'll misrecognize our own subjective idea, which we've created by reason, for an objective thing which really exists somewhere out there. And we'll try to speak clearly about the idea as though it were a thing, even though doing so inevitably leads one in contradiction. For example, one will try to talk about one's freedom to act as though it were a real thing, only to find that on one hand you will end up concluding that one's act was completely outside the chain of causes and effects. But on the other hand, if all you're doing is thinking rationally about it, you'll find that the opposite is true. Every act actually is determined as an effect by causes. So you'll end up affirming both the thesis and the antithesis, because you seem to be looking at a real object when it's actually just your own subjective idea in disguise. Similarly, you'll conclude that the cosmos has limits, and also that it's limitless. You'll conclude that the universe had a beginning in time, and that it did not. And this is, once again, following from a confusion between concepts, which are universals that individuals can be subsumed under, and ideas which are not that at all. Likewise, in metaphysics, the statements you deal with aren't even false, as Kant notes. They fail the test of having any truth value at all, because they are totally different from the sort of true or false statements which you would have generated by the understanding in accord with the concepts. Now, interestingly, Kant basically concludes the text by showing why the different rational ideas within the pseudoscience of metaphysics fail, which is going to be slightly different for each of them. So if we take the soul as the first one and define this as the psychological idea of reason, we find that our attempts to know about the soul on purely rational grounds within metaphysics will fail, because ultimately we make an impossible demand of our judgment. We can only describe a subject like, say, the soul through supplementing the substance with various predicates. But the problem is that in attempting to know about the self as nothing but the underlying substance called the soul, we make it impossible to supplement that substance with anything which actually could tell us something about it, because every time you supplement it with a predicate, you would say, no, I don't want it to know about one of the predicates of the substance, I want to know about the substance itself. This leads to an infinite regress in which you never actually succeed in finding a predicate that directly describes the subject or substance called the soul, and therefore you never actually arrive at knowledge, because in terms of the structure of the judgment itself, you are trying to demand the impossible. For example, we know that our inquiries into the self that are of a merely empirical nature are not going to be leading us to the metaphysical construct called the soul. Insofar as we come to know about ourselves in terms of merely mundane empirical observations, that's not the soul. Rather, that's just the field of empirical psychology, in which we study ourselves as an animal situated within a environment of stimuli, influences, etc. So even if we can say something about ourselves of a psychological variety, it will be rejected as something that does not take us to the substance of the soul itself. Similarly, the cosmological idea of reason will fail, despite the fact that it does not make quite the same error that rational psychology or the study of the soul would. Whereas attempts to examine the soul as a substance fail because one tries to consider the object not as it could be given to the senses, but as it is never given to the five senses. The cosmos is a little bit trickier because it seems to remain within the territory of ordinary investigations, while still ultimately dealing with nothing but a product of reason itself. The problem is that the cosmos extends the object of experience so far beyond the limits of the ordinary use of reason that reason cannot ever catch up with the chimera that it has itself produced, because the cosmos extends beyond any limits which one can practically deal with. It's impossible to know about it. This is why you have to affirm both the thesis that the cosmos has limits in space and the antithesis that it is limitless, because you have generated a chimera which it is impossible for you to present as an object of knowledge, while demanding that you form statements about it as an object of knowledge. Finally, the theological idea will fail for the exact opposite, for here, reason does not try to extend the object of experience beyond all possible limits like the cosmos. Instead, here, reason will break with experience altogether in order to construct a hypothetical object called the God of reason itself, not the God of traditional religion, but rather the God of, say, deism, without realizing that the thing which seems to be an object is nothing except a set of various concepts. These concepts are combined to form the idea of the most perfect being, say the first cause of all things in the universe, the creator, etc. But the danger here is that it's not really an object at all. The problem here is not that such an idea is incomprehensible, as some objects of experience admittedly turn out to be. The problem, paradoxically, is that such an idea is nothing except understandable. I can understand what each of these individual concepts might mean that I've put together to form this composite concept called the God of deism, but precisely because these are just concepts with no input from experience, it fails to yield any real knowledge. Remember, you have to have both an intuition and a concept in order to have knowledge, according to Kant at the beginning of the critique of pure reason. Here, instead, we just have a bunch of concepts which make so much sense that we fail to see that there's actually no object corresponding to it. Now, technically, the last section of the book is titled, How is Metaphysics Possible as a Science? The short answer, of course, is that it is not. Now, we find here that the difference is that the use of the pure concepts yields real knowledge only if it is combined with intuition, because the result of combining those two things is something called an appearance. In metaphysics, of course, the intuition is missing, and insofar as you have concepts, they're left to run amok with nothing except each other as company. The result is something which seems like knowledge, even a superior form of knowledge because it's purely conceptual, but it's actually not that at all. Rather than be knowledge of an appearance, which has actually appeared, it's rather just an illusion constructed by the mind itself. And this is something which can be remedied, Kant argues, only through performing critique, which is reason's inquiry into its own nature and the separation of its various faculties. Kant argues or predicts that critique will have the same relation to metaphysics that chemistry had already taken with regard to alchemy, or astronomy had taken with regard to astrology. Certainly you can still engage in alchemy or astrology, but you'll always have a sense that they're saying unclearly in a much older and earlier form what was eventually stated much more clearly within the quote-unquote real sciences of chemistry and astronomy. Now, the big difference between metaphysics and critique in particular is that critique alone can actually be completed. Reason can investigate itself so thoroughly as to reconstruct a complete and unified picture of its various parts, as well as their uses and their limits. Metaphysics, on the other hand, can never be completed because for all the thousands of years people have been doing it, they failed to ever actually arrive at even a single truth that is actually apodictic in the sense of universally and necessarily true in the way that the truths of mathematics would be. Now, for this reason, Kant argues that anyone who gets a taste of critique will lose their taste for metaphysics in much the same way that somebody who drinks real grape juice will probably lose their taste for purple Kool-Aid.